Hello, and welcome to the Camera Rolling Podcast. This is episode 5 of season 2, and I'm your host, Ronnie. Today, I'm going to be talking about one of the few movies that had me in tears by the end, called More Than Blue. But before I get started, I'm going to tell you about my recent watches. This week, I watched yet another Lifetime movie about a true crime case. This one is The Suitcase Killer, and it's based on the Melanie McGuire case. It's pretty self-explanatory in that Melanie McGuire killed her husband and put his body part in suitcases. The case itself is really interesting to me, specifically because usually in cases of spousal murder, it's the other way around. However, in this movie, the portrayals, I think, were just really bad. I also think that true crime media, which I want to talk about more in depth at a later date, but I think that true crime media is kind of exploitative, especially when it's based on a particular case and treats it like a soap drama and not a horrific crime that happened to a real person. So I think as a movie, sometimes these Lifetime movies are fun to watch, but they're not great in the sense that they're, again, exploitative and they dramatize things to the point that it takes away from the sadness that you should be feeling by the end. So the next movie is Memories of Murder, directed by Bong Joon-ho, and of course it's a Korean film. The movie is technically based on true crime. It's technically based on real crimes that happen, but I think it's able to grasp the gravity of the situation a lot better than the one I was just talking about by Lifetime. Essentially, Song Kang-ho's character is a detective working on the case with a few others, and it seems there's been some murders in their small town, and they're just working to solve the crime. I think Bong Joon-ho is really good about building narratives that intertwine with one another, both in the historical context of the movie, but also the inner workings of the detectives themselves trying to understand the killer. I think it's especially interesting because of the ending, in that when the movie was released, they actually didn't have the case solved, so the movie does the same. It doesn't let you really know who the murderer is. And interviews with the actual murderer that they found later just make the story and the ending even more poignant, in that the real-life murderer talks about how he was overlooked so many times by police when he was right there. Like, he talked to the police multiple times, and obviously he didn't say anything. And thinking back to the ending of Song Kang-ho's character, hearing the little girl describe the murderer essentially as looking ordinary doesn't clarify anything about who it could have been for the audience. Like, once you get to the end of a movie like this, you either want to know who it is, or you can look back and say, oh, I know exactly who it was. But in this scenario, we don't, and we won't. Either way, let's get into some heartfelt, lovey-dovey stuff in today's movie. The movie I'm discussing today is also a Korean film. There's a lot of Korean films that just really stick with me, of the few that I've seen, and this one in particular stuck with me so bad. I watched it every year for a few years on Valentine's Day because it's so sad, but it's just also a very beautiful story in my opinion. So the title is translated to More Than Blue, or Sadder Than the Saddest Story, but when it's read out, it's 슬픔보다 더 슬픈 이야기. So it's sadder than the saddest story. It was directed and written by Won Tae-yeon, and it was actually his directorial debut. Jeez. You can really see through his career history in writing poetry and lyrics that it's a very personal story, and you can tell he's writing what feels familiar to him, which I always like to hear from a writer and or director, that the story that they're portraying is similar to their own life and experience, because I think it just makes it even better. Like, when you feel great watching a story and you're like, wow, this feels so real, it's because it kind of is. The movie is about Kay and Cream. They met in high school and pretty much stayed together into adulthood because they had both been orphaned. However, they really only stayed friends, and their relationship is sort of tested when Cream gets engaged to another man. The movie also has a twist partway through, so there will be spoilers. I always talk about spoilers in my videos, so if you hear a movie and you don't want to hear a spoiler, or you want to watch the movie and you don't want spoilers, then I would always suggest to watch it before you watch my video. So I'm going to take you through the movie, and there's a lot of details in it that, again, I think it's important to watch the movie to really catch a lot of these details and really feel what I mean when I say that this movie is very heavy. And if you're not a fan of like slower movies, then you probably won't like a movie like this. There's a lot of Korean films that are more slow burn type of films, but they're very, very good. I highly recommend foreign films in any capacity, but specifically I like Korean films because most of them that I've seen that have stuck with me have been slow burns. Either way, the movie opens in a recording studio where some producers want a singer named Seung-chul to sing a new song for an upcoming drama, but he's not into the lyrics of the song and walks out. So later, the men discuss another option for the song when their driver plays a song from an old album that didn't do well. They end up liking the song and want to find the artist, so they decide to drive to a cafe that's owned by someone who knows the artist. They sit around a fire looking at the album to see that the song they like was called No One Else Like Thee by someone named Cream. But it turns out she's gone, and so is a guy named Kang Chul-kyu, but he goes by K throughout the story, that he was also in the industry. Essentially, she left after he died. They also note that he died right after he watched Cream get married. And a story set up like this kind of reminds me of the way Titanic is set up, in that it's kind of a second-hand story that it will lead into the main plot. I don't mind when something starts off with a somewhat unrelated narrative to the main storyline of the romance. I think these setups are actually a really interesting way of introducing a story that feels like a legend or fantastical or mystical, like something that has that feeling of grandness that can only be expressed through generations of retelling. And I really do think that captures the way that I feel about the couple in the movie, in that I want Kay and Cream to be together so badly, and it feels like this just amazing story, even though a lot of the movie is actually very mundane. Either way, this sparks the director to ask how everything happened, so it fades into a high school boy running laps where a girl is smoking and watching him from afar. He lays down on the bench to close his eyes, only to find the girl standing over him still smoking. She says hi and puts the cigarette in his mouth as the teacher approaches. Confused, he watches her walk away, but he ends up getting caught, and the teacher actually beats him and drags him inside as he looks back. And this was, I feel like, pretty common in Korea, unfortunately. I'm not laughing because it's funny, but just that it's just an interesting thing that there's a lot of physicality. If you'll notice in Korean movies, they can be very physical, but you'll notice sort of in anything to do with high schools or school, you'll notice that there's like a heavy amount of bullying, which is still very prevalent in today's Korean society. And I say Korea as in South Korea. I think we all know that at this point. But at the same time, if you see any Korean movies that do have teachers hitting or beating the kids at the school, it's obviously they don't do it today, like they aren't supposed to, but it did for a long time happen, and I don't think there's any room to say anything negative about that, in the sense that they did in America too. Like, I think my parents, or maybe their parents, remember getting hit when they were in K through 12, so yeah, it's really only recent that teachers in the past maybe 30 or 40 years have not been able to hit kids. So either way, I think that this is supposed to take place in like the 80s or 90s in Korea. So either way, the teacher beats him on the back of the legs with like a sort of, not a paddle, but like almost like a smallish bat. But he drags him inside while Kay looks back, and the narrator explains that it was love at first sight. Later, we see Cream putting medicine on the back of Kay's legs where he'd been hit, which feels sort of strange to him, and I think to a lot of people, this would probably be strange to be partially exposed to a girl that he, like, doesn't know very well, because he does have, like, his pants sort of down so that she can, like, put the medicine, like, on his leg. So Kay asks how she knows his name, but she only responds with asking him if he wants her to live with him in his empty apartment. And this is another moment where, like, culturally, if you don't know, sometimes in case you didn't know, like, culturally, if you're confused as to why he lives in an apartment but he's a high schooler, essentially this sometimes happens, I think, in Eastern Asia, like in China, Japan, or Korea, where parents will want their kids to go to a better school. So instead of them uprooting their entire life and moving to another place, they'll send their kids to school at a better school and have their kids take up residence near that in their own apartment. Obviously, this doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough that it would make sense to a viewer in East Asia that he would be living by himself without his parents in his own apartment. And of course, the parents pay for the apartment and everything, so it's very similar to the way that a lot of college students in America might live, where I know that when I was in college, there were a lot of students who had their parents just pay for the apartment so they didn't have to live in the dorms, and that was perfectly normal. So this is a very similar situation. Either way, they're kind of sitting there after she's asked sort of to move in, and then she kisses him, and it's the beginning of their more than friendship, less than lovers relationship. She tells them to come up with nicknames for each other, and he chooses Cream because she's cold but sweet and soft like ice cream, and for her, he wasn't A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, just K. And again, it's a lot sweeter in the movie. It sounds ridiculous when I'm explaining it. Then we get kind of a montage of over the years they have awkward moments, like him walking in on her changing and her, like, throwing something at him, but also having, like, good times, like eating noodles together or listening to music on a rainy day or drinking coffee, and them hating school so they skip school, and that they're both orphans. So into young adulthood, they just stood by each other. She sort of got him out of his shell, taking him to concerts with loud music where he clearly doesn't fit in because it's not his vibe. And he sort of just has been watching her from the sidelines, especially as she's had these tumultuous relationships with other men. But eventually we see him do his mandatory military service, but return to her with open arms. And again, this is another thing that culturally, if you don't know, in Korea, you, as a man, you have to serve, I think, 1 or 2 years military service, and it's mandatory for every man except for those who are specifically excluded. That's why if you're into K-pop, you may see, like, your favorite K-pop artist and be really excited, and then they disappear for, like, a year because they've gone off to their mandatory military service, so it's just a thing. However, as much as he loves her, he would never tell her because he had cancer. Then we fade to the beginning of when things began to change. We see Kay taking his medication and going to work, and at the time, the label that he worked for, they kind of work for, like, a label but also, like, a radio show. It's kind of up in the air. I'm not exactly sure how those companies interact, so I don't know if he's specifically at a record label or if he's just a sound producer type of guy. I have no idea. Either way, the place that he works, there's a new girl that they want to debut as Cat Girl, and we also see that Seungchul actually met Kay at one point, just very briefly, but he was actually a new artist with that label when all of this was happening. Either way, we see President Kim trying to bribe Kay to move Catgirl's career along by having her on his radio show. Meanwhile, we have Cream, who's also kind of working at this company. Again, it's kind of confusing and maybe somebody can like clarify it if they've seen the movie enough to understand if they work for a record label or what. But Cream is a writer. She writes lyrics for different songs. But it's obvious when she's in the studio listening to Catgirl try to sing these songs that she's fed up, and she walks out. And at one point she even confronts Catgirl in the studio, pretty much saying, "Why are you becoming a singer? Like, you're really bad." Then we also find out that Kay's father died from the same cancer when he goes to check in with his doctor. And when he comes home, he finds Cream under a blanket crying. They hug, and she tells him that they told her that she needed to rewrite the song for Catgirl. Again, part of the reason I like this movie is that it does have this grand sort of story about it, and yet most of the love that we see between them is just mundane things, and the next conversation I think is an example of that. So Cream pretty much pulls a "would you love me if I was a worm," but asks him if he was reborn as an object, what would he be? He thinks about it, and before he can really answer, she decides to record his thoughts on tape, and it seems like she does this pretty often in recording their conversations. So he says he'd be born again as a ring, or a pair of glasses, or a bed, or a diary. And when she asks why these mundane items, he says, "You can buy me. It'll always be fun at your side." Then he sort of like pats her on the head, like another soothing moment for her, and then they eat dinner. And at dinner, she asks him if he has any secrets, and he says, "I like you." And the way he says it, it's very like point blank. There's nothing more to it, and it seems that, like, again, he's said this 1,000 times. It's nothing new. Then she asks if he has a wish. He deflects and tells her to eat, but he eventually answers and tells her that he wants to see her meet a great guy and get married. When she asks, "Why can't I marry you?" he tells her that he's not a great guy. But we all know that it's because he's dying that he can't be with her. And again, we get a cute little, they go into work and they make funny faces at each other through the glass while she's kind of on the radio show and he's like out there producing it. And we see just more of their relationship and how much they like each other. However, when Cream goes to get a coffee, but there's no cups, so she's like wasted her coin and like the coffee just runs down the drain, she asks a man that's sitting behind her if she can have his cup. She puts in another coin and gets the coffee, and when she takes a drink, she says it's like they've kissed since they used the same cup. And then she just walks away. And you know, I'm autistic, so some of these moments where Cream is being really sort of neutral in her facial expression or not really inflecting maybe the way that a person normally would, leads me to believe that she and them are potentially along that line, but also it could just be a cultural thing. I'm not sure. So yeah, I'm not saying she is, but it was just one of those moments where it made me think of me and how I sometimes say things that feel really out of pocket, but it's just what's ever in my head, and there's no particular positive or negative feeling I'm trying to invoke with that. It's just a thought. But after this encounter, she asks a coworker about the man who happened to be a dentist, so she makes an appointment with him, and at the appointment, she says, "We kiss on the first day, you see inside me on the second day. What should we do on the third day?" And again, this is with little to no expression, and he's confused, but she just smiles at him. Like, she knows she's kind of, like, you know, she's flirting a little bit in whatever way that is. I think it's because she's so straightforward that people find it alluring that someone would just say that when in reality it's just like an autistic trait, to be honest and blunt. So this leads her to announce to Kay later that she's in love with a dentist. You can see how she's conflated her interaction with the dentist as being intimate, yet it's interesting because in this scene when she's saying that she's in love, and you can see this, her conflating this instance that Kay is in the shower and she's also in the bathroom, like so close to intimacy, yet they're so far from each other in this moment. And later when Kay picks up things around the house, he takes another one of his pills, sort of with this melancholic look. And I think unrequited love is so hard to watch in this kind of proximity. I think most of us can understand the feeling of liking someone but not getting to tell them. And it's even more heartbreaking when the person is someone you see every day, and even more so that he lives with her. Like me being the awkward kid that I was, I had crushes all the time, but I don't think any of them knew it, or I would never admit to it. And I don't know, it's just kind of sad to think that he's sitting there loving her and getting to love her, and still they aren't in a relationship and they aren't together. So at work, Kay actually inquires about the dentist, whose name is Cha Ju-hwan, and he finds out that he's rich and nice and just this good, famous dentist. He also does some more investigating to find out the guy is healthy and has no medical problems that he knows of. Then Cream asks Juhan to get drinks, and he seems pretty intrigued. However, we find out from President Kim's investigation that Juhan has a fiance. Still, though, he goes for drinks with Cream. She asks if he's ever been in love, the way that a rock sinks to the bottom of a river, and he says he's engaged, and she laughs and says it doesn't matter. That night, she climbs into Kay's bed, saying it's cold, and just cuddling up to him, and he asks what she likes about the dentist, and she says it's like being sterilized. And I feel like in that moment, we kind of understand what she means, but like saying it like that sounds sort of weird. And maybe it's a language barrier thing because I wasn't listening close enough to know if sterilize is the actual translation, because I know there's a few times in movies where I'll notice that they translate something a little bit differently than maybe the meaning in Korean, but I wasn't paying enough attention to take note of this. But it is a weird moment because I don't really know what she means by that. And yet, at the same time, I know exactly what she means. However, when she's asleep, he actually just leaves the bed. The next morning, he makes them breakfast, but it seems like she's in a rush, so suddenly he's all alone with this entire meal. But he notices that she forgot her phone and answers the phone when it rings, and it's Juhan calling to cancel their plans. So Kay decides to deliver the message in person, and he goes to meet her, but just kind of gets lost in his thoughts. And I like in this movie that there's no narration of the thoughts. We only get to really see his reaction and his facial expressions instead of hearing, oh, I was so in love with her. Oh, I can't believe I'm doing this. Da 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 da. Like, we don't get any of that narration. And I actually love that because it really lets an actor shine in their position, because he plays this role so well that I know he's thinking about her. I know that he's getting lost in his thoughts just of this overwhelming feeling that she's getting closer and closer to somebody that's not him. But still, he shows up to the cafe restaurant that they were going to meet at, and of course she's surprised, but she's like, no, stay, let's eat anyway. And I wrote this note because I was listening to music as I was watching the movie, and She Needs Him by Hers, just, it fit the movie so well. I was like, man, this is so sad. So President Kim presses Kay to find out why he needs info on Juhan. And when I say President Kim, I mean president as in like he's a higher up in the company, not that he's literally the president. But we cut to dinner with Juhan and his fiance, so we kind of get to see what she looks like, and her name is Jenna. And we also find out that President Kim has found some dirt on her, that she's cheating on the dentist. So at work, Kay actually collapses, so he's taken to the hospital, and Cream comes to see him, but he blows her off. He's just like, it seems like he might be on some painkillers, and so he's kind of maybe high, and so he's just kind of pushing her away. And she asks why he keeps feigning to the doctor, and he gives a pretty vague answer about not getting enough nutrients, which doesn't make sense because they eat the same things. Then, kind of like under an overpass, I think, Kay confronts the fiance Jenna to make her break up with Juhan because he has photos of her with another man, and she pretty much just gets angry and takes the photos. and it didn't work. And after that, Kay and this other guy go to dinner, and this other guy is actually our narrator. He's the guy who is telling the story that we saw at the beginning. He's also kind of like an assistant for President Kim, so he's like sort of around the story. And this is when he decides to when Kay decides to tell him his story. He explains that he's dying like his dad was, and that's why his mom abandoned him, because she didn't want to live through that again. And that's essentially when he became extremely lonely. But Kay won't give up in trying to get the fiancé to leave Juhwan by telling her his story and saying, I'm gonna die, so like I want her to be with somebody and you don't want to be with him anyway. And Jenna's actually a photographer, and so she pretty much says, yeah, I'll break up with him if you let me take your photo. Then we see Kay and Cream show up to sort of a work dinner where Juhwan is also there. And again, this is another cultural thing, but this happens a lot in America as well, where an entire office or group of people who work together will go out for drinks or dinner after work. But after they arrive, Kay actually decides to leave. He's not feeling well, and as he walks away, he sort of stumbles and like falls into like something, like sort of just falls into the wall in the alley. And later, Cream comes home and they share a bowl of noodles, and you can just tell that they've done this a million times over. Then at the photo shoot with Jenna, she asks him about what he wants to do with what's left of his life, and he really doesn't want to talk to her. His heart is so broken at this point, and I don't think that he's the kind of person who really opens up and shares about his feelings. Then she asks him what love is, and he says, like brushing your teeth. And I think what he means is that you do it for your health, you do it for you so that you can smile, but you also do it for them, like you do it for your teeth. And that's sort of what I imagine what he means, but again, it's one of those, you hear it and you sort of just know what it means, and it's hard to explain why it means that. At the dentist, he asks why Cream didn't show up last time, and Cream responds that he's falling for her because there's no way he asks about every single patient who doesn't show up. So at work, Kay gets reprimanded pretty much for taking the bribe, and now they're being audited, and yeah, essentially they're having problems, and Kay is sort of at the forefront of it, and he's taking the brunt of it, but he's not paying attention. He's really just preoccupied with counting the number of days he has left. If you notice, there's multiple times where he just stares at a particular number, and the number keeps getting lower, and it's assumed that this is how many days he has left. That when he sees the 96, when he sees the 88, that those are the days that he has left. So the photographer breaks it off with Juhwan, who isn't surprised. So Juhwan goes out with Cream again to tell her his engagement is off, and she takes this time to sort of tell him about her parents, that they died one day in a car crash while she was at school, and essentially that's when she met Kay, or at least a year after that is when she met Kay, and she's been with him ever since. And for some reason, Juhwan turns to her asking for a kiss, and it sort of cuts to Kay knocking over a glass at their house, and she calls him stupid, and he walks away. And so later she slips a note under his door, still calling him an idiot, and it's kind of assumed that everything is just better now. That them having not talked is just sort of the way that they solve this sort of weird tension that they had, where he was sort of upset but not really, and it has more to do with what's going on with him than it does her actual actions. But this is also when we see a turning point in which Cream is in like the radio studio and she's waving hi, but this time it's to Juhwan, and Kay sort of feels uncomfortable as she starts to act how she normally would, but not directed at him. And it seems like Kay is getting fired, but he tells them he's just gonna go abroad for a while, and our narrator in this story, he begins to cry because he knows it's a lie. He knows that Kay is going to die. At home, Cream plays the demo of a new song that she's written, and she begins to record as she asks Kay what marriage is. another situation where they're just sitting around and she wants to record their conversation. And he responds with a toothbrush holder. And of course she's like, why? And he says, there's only one holder, but many toothbrushes. And she asks, how is that marriage? And he says, being together as one, like toothbrushes in a holder. And so, of course, she's like, I must already be married. But he says, you can't be married without a wedding. And this is, like, clearly the turning point where, like, we get the musings of a wedding, and we sort of get this push towards, okay, now she needs to get married to actually be married. However, after this conversation, she leaves to go to the bathroom, and he picks up her recorder, and it seems that he records a message that we don't get to hear. Then, at a meeting with Juhwan, it's clear that he feels uncomfortable with the relationship that Kay and Cream have. And so he pretty much says that once Cream and I are married, Kay needs to back out. Like, he needs to leave her alone. She's my girl now. And of course, Kay is sitting there like, of course. I'll... He pretty much is like, that's fine with me. I won't be around. But one of the things that Cream really wanted was for her and Kay to pick out a wedding dress for her. So he goes with her to pick one out. And of course, she's, being bubbly and playing around. And she tells him to try on the groom suit when the woman at the place is like, oh, why don't we try on a suit for you? Because you're the groom. And he's like, oh, I'm not. But Cream's like, no, try it on. And obviously, this is like hard for him. This is the future that he always wanted but is never going to have. And he stands up next to her and they take a little Polaroid of them together, and Cream is just smiling as wide as possible. And it's just really sad that he's getting to see this future that he's never going to have. And they go to essentially change out of that, and in the dressing room he just begins to cry, and he changes back into his clothes and leaves without saying a word. And when she gets out of the dressing room, she sees that he's gone, and essentially he's crying as he walks away. He's bawling. And honestly, I think if I was in his position, this would also be a turning point for me. Like, this would be my breaking point of literally standing there, seeing the woman that I love in a wedding dress and seeing me next to her and knowing that that's not reality. That would be so heartbreaking. And, as he does cry there in public, in the streets, he just falls to his knees and the world stops around him. Then at another photo shoot, he talks with the photographer again, and he asks if she can send Cream flowers on her anniversary for a few years after he's gone, because he wants it to seem like he's still alive, that he, again, has just gone abroad. And Jenna decides to kiss him and pretty much is like, you should die next to me. Like, you should... I want to be by your side. Like, essentially, we should hook up. And he's like, no. And of course, whenever he comes home, Cream is upset that he left the dress place without saying anything, but he also seems upset. He tells her not to touch his phone when she does, and he's pretty much just blowing up at her in this moment. And again, I think it's that he's so frustrated that she doesn't know or can't know that he's in love with her. And so when she touches his phone, he pretty much says, like, you can't just do whatever you want with me, like I'm an object. And I think this speaks to a larger part of their relationship, in that that's kind of how their relationship is that he's being pulled along as this observer, as this object in her life. And I think in that moment, it becomes very clear that that is how it is. And not necessarily in a bad way, but like that sometimes happens where you have a very outgoing friend or a significant other that's very outgoing, and you tag along because you want to be there and you want to support them and you want to feel that happiness that makes you feel happy. But at the same time, you can sometimes feel like an object, like you are just being dragged around. And I think that that's sort of what that was pointing to, but not necessarily to say that their relationship is over, just that there are issues. But later, Jenna stops by the apartment looking for Kay, and of course this strikes Cream as odd because she's really the only one who calls him Kay, and also, who is this lady? But he ends up going with her, and they look at flowers that he wants her to send to Cream, and she tells him he shouldn't die with these feelings inside of him, and he pretty much says no, that he wants to be the one marrying Cream tomorrow, but that's just a dream. That's something he's never gonna have, and he's done dreaming. And it seems that he and Cream aren't on speaking terms when he comes home and he gets to his room and he texts her goodnight, but she asks if he's eaten, so they have a small meal together. And again, this is another moment where mundane things feel very heavy. And specifically with meal culture in Korea, I know most cultures around the world have a very heavy placement on meals and on eating together as a family, and that's again just another part of Korean culture as well, in that eating alone is considered very sad and that a meal should be shared with people, specifically because the way that a lot of meals in places like China, Japan, and Korea, they have these large meals that have lots of different little side dishes that are meant to be eaten by multiple people, that people don't just order one thing for themselves, but the whole table orders a bunch for everyone, or a bunch of little things for everyone, so you can all share the meal. And so the fact that they eat meals together, and that is the first thing that she asks him, like, have you eaten? And again, this is in a lot of cultures where when someone asks if you've eaten, they want to make sure that you're fed, not only because they care about you and they care about your health and that eating is important, but also because if you haven't eaten, that they want to eat with you and that they want to share that moment where, you know, even with animals, when they eat, that's the moment that they're vulnerable. It's the moment that they're doing something that's instinctual that they have to do, and it's just like a moment that you get to share with somebody else that's really important, yet you do it every day, and it's so mundane. And that's, again, what I love about this movie. So even though they are eating together, it's also very awkward because they're not talking to each other, and she texts him that she's not talking to him, so he apologizes for everything, and she pretty much says sorry for everything too. And he's about to send I love you. He types it out. He types out 사랑해. But instead, he sends I like you, like he always does. So then we see Kay walking her down the aisle to Juhan at the wedding, and he gives her away. And I've never seen someone look so sad. But in this moment, it's when we truly say goodbye to that relationship, in that he literally hands her over to Juhan, and those two go up to the priest to get married at the top of the stairs, and Kay just walks out of the church. And this is the moment when we return to the fireside with the narrator, and of course they wonder, like, what happened to Cream? We're trying to find, like, the person who wrote this song, and that's Cream, right? And Seungchul is like, I want to record the song. And essentially we get to see sort of this, like, little sad montage almost of, like, people being like, where's Cream, what's going on? And it seems that it's been 3 years, because we see Jenna with the plant that Kay had picked out, and she's just received the 3rd plant for the anniversary of Cream and Juhan's marriage. This is when they zoom into the clock that at one point Kay had started a clock in the photographer's sort of studio, and this is when the clock sort of resets itself and we go back to seeing Cream in bed. It seems like she's struggling to think of lyrics, so she goes through Kay's things and she ends up finding his medicine. And of course, he's been telling her all along that they're vitamins, so she takes a few and she's like, oh, this will help me think. But she ends up in the hospital to find out that the pills are actually for very intense pain, like for those with cancer who are literally dying. And so in this sort of high or inebriated state, she falls into a dream, a vision of her family in the car as they drove away to their deaths. And we now see Kay in the back seat. And this is when we get narration from her. And this is from her perspective, everything that happened up until she was married. And she recounts that after she found out that Kay was dying, that she was destroyed. And that was actually the reason she'd been crying earlier when Kay came home, and that it wasn't because of work, it was that she just found out he was dying. We also find out that the day that Kay's mom abandoned him, Cream was actually sitting right behind him, hearing and recording the entire conversation. And she pretty much said that as sad as she was that her family had passed, he looked sadder than she ever was. We also recount when she asked him about his secret and if he has one, and she was frustrated that he wouldn't just say that he was dying. But when she asked about his wish, he wanted her to get married to a great guy, so that's what she set out to do. And of course, knowing all of this, it reframes everything that happened from that moment on. So when he fainted, she was in the hospital room overhearing this conversation with the doctor that he wanted to save her the pain of falling in love with him because she needs someone beside her and he knows that he won't be there forever. We also find that she specifically picked out the dentist guy, that she went after him for a reason. And that whenever she came to cuddle with Kay in the middle of the night saying it was cold and he left, after he left, she listened to the tape of them over again and was just crying. And also the night that he left the work dinner and had stumbled away, that she was watching him and accidentally knocked over the table that they were sitting at, and she went after him, following him, saying that if he turned around, she would tell him everything, that she would admit that she knew, and that things would change, and they would embrace each other, and that they could be together, but he never turned around. So the scene when they're eating noodles together, she was actually thinking about him.
제발 나한테 얘기해. 내가 안아줄게. 내가 같이 죽어줄게. 네가 이때까지 잘해준 거 너 따라가서 내가 다 갚아줄게. 라는 말을 다시 물 한 잔과 삼키며.
When they had the conversation about marriage, she moved things along with the dentist as quickly as she could, knowing that she wanted to marry this guy and make his wish come true before he died. And at the dress fitting, after they got the photo taken and the curtains were drawn and he was changing in his changing room, she was also looking at the photo of them together and crying. So at that moment, they were technically both crying at the same time, knowing that they weren't going to be together and they were so close to the future they could have had. And also when he came home angry and they were texting at the table, that she wanted to say, "I love you too." And when they were washing dishes later that evening, he asks when she's going to talk to him again. And she says, why couldn't he hear her the whole time screaming at him? And he says he didn't hear anything. So she asks how mutes can love. Then he says, "I love you." And she says, "Me too." And they move on. And it's like every other time that he said, "I like you," except for this time he actually says, "I love you."
사랑해.
And then we get to recount her wedding day and her being walked down the aisle by him and being so happy to be next to him and just overwhelmed. But when he had to walk away and she had to give her hand over to Juhwan, that she was heartbroken about that. And because they weren't looking at each other, I don't think they saw each other's reaction. And I think in that moment, Juhwan should have known that they looked really sad for this to be happening, that their facial expressions changed as they walked closer and closer to him. But either way, Kay walks away and a tear falls down her cheek. And unfortunately, they don't look back at each other. Then we transition to a resting place where Juhwan is looking at a photo of the two, and it's Kay and Cream in that wedding dress photo. And this time we see things from his perspective as he sort of encountered the two. And just seeing them interact, I think he immediately knew that they were meant to be together. So at this place, he puts the photo in one of the boxes along with the tape recorder, and it's playing. And essentially the tape recorder is her recorder that is filled with a bunch of moments between the two. A bunch of mundane moments where they're talking and arguing and just bickering with each other, but in a loving way. And I'm going to read what she says in the very end, and I'm not sure if I'll just put in the clip or if I'll just read it, but essentially she says,
철규야, 나 지금 널 만나러 간다. 걱정하지 마. 난 널 믿어. 넌 내 나침반이거든. 기억나? 네가 내 눈앞에 없어도 난 널 볼 수 있다고 얘기했던 거. 어디든 마음 편히 가. 내가 조금 있다가 널 찾아낼게. 널 찾아온 날 보고 화를 내면 안 돼. 네가 왜 따라왔는지 묻거나 나를 보고 놀라거나 혼내거나 해서도 안 돼. 힘들게 널 찾아갔는데 네가 그래버리면 난 울지도 몰라. 우리 거기서 다시 만나면 두 번 다시 울지 말자. 기다려. 내가 곧 갈게.
now we know that she went to him like she said she would. And I'm not gonna lie, even after rewatching this movie, I know what happens. Again, there's a twist sort of at the end, and it's like once you know it, you rewatch it with new eyes, and I still cried. In rewatching it for this video, I cried because it's heartbreaking. I always love a movie where things don't turn out how we want them to, and I'm glad that they loved each other. Like, that's the great thing about this movie, is that although it's unrequited love, although they didn't necessarily tell each other that they loved one another, they got to love each other. They got to be together without being together, and that's the part that, like, makes me happy and makes this, like, a romance to me and not just a tragedy, is that even though they never said it to each other, they always showed that they loved each other, and I feel like that's the most important part. Because when you think about it, you have something like Titanic, where they never actually got to be together. They shared special moments with one another, and they had this very short sort of Romeo and Juliet love where they weren't meant to be together because their families were fighting or because they were from two different worlds, and then something crazy happened and one of them passes, and it's like, oh man, so-and-so had to live the rest of their life, and they never got to be with that person. But this is especially sad to me because they did get to be with one another. They got to essentially go from being teenagers to adults with each other. But this is honestly, it's so heartbreaking, and I know most of the time when you think of a romance movie, you think about one like a rom-com where they come together in the end and you're like, yay, they fell in love. But like this one is like, you know, this tragic love story that they're together the whole time, but they can never be together forever, and at the end, they end up being together forever, but in the worst way possible. And this wasn't necessarily an analysis of this movie. It was more so, I just want to tell you about this movie because I love it so much, and I feel like it's underrated, and it's not based on a book or anything. There's been some, like, remakes of it in the past few years, but for the most part, this is pretty much an original story. It's not adapted from anything, and I think that makes it even more special to me because I think a lot of the things like Romeo and Juliet, like, you can watch it but you know it's gonna happen, you know it's a book, you know it's been told over and over again, and this is not that. Like, this is just the story that it is, and I don't know, I like stories like that where they truly come from the writer. Either way, this is one of my favorite romance movies because I think in many ways this is a lot of the love stories that we hear, is that there are people who just love each other but maybe aren't together. I don't know. I don't know what to say. Anyway, I love this movie, and I hope you go watch it, or that you watched it before you watched this video because I did give away everything. But either way, with that, keep watching movies, and I'll see you next week.